So when we look at like this big, mix, right? Something called an amalgamation, which is a very fun word to say, amalgamation of factors that lead to conflict. Because if you think about all these different people living together in the same space, right? And what we know about the Industrial Revolution, right, is that this was not a great time, in certain cases, right? Because if we think about Industrial Revolution times, which I'm just calling IR, if we think about this era of times, what is our next color going to be? You guys don't like, I don't like any of those either. Thank you for agreeing. If you think about Industrial Revolution times, right, there's a lot of food insecurity that could happen, right? So if there are delays in food production or they're coming, to it, right? There's a lot of like food that may not show up, or you're otherwise like competing with people for the same kind of food or a lot, right? So there's a lot of competition, right? You also have this cases, right, where there is limited housing. It's very cramped, which also means that between the food and for everything else, right, it's also expensive. And because like the eras that we're talking in, right, it's like the 1800s, right? There's a lot of like, different cultures, right? But there's a lot of clash, right? It's not a very accepting time at this point where, it's the kind of thing where like, if you speak a different language, you're from a different background, right? You're associated with, certain stereotypes and, it's really like, frowned upon, which, maybe doesn't seem all that different from today, but I think it's important to recognize that like today is the improvement and it is significantly better than it used to be. Point being is that it used to be a lot of violent, a lot of like, actual gangs on the streets, between people for different, ethnic groups that were coming in, right? It's also a lot of like disease, and and other sickness, child death. There's like all kinds of like social problems are happening, right? There's not a lot of clean water supplies. Cities are trying to figure this out. There's a lot of like political corruption. It's so point being is that you have all these, cities that are attracting like a lot of people. And what ends up happening, right, is that you have, the recipe for like kind of conflict. And so what ends up happening, oh, you also, it's like, sorry, one more thing, right? Given the time, right? Everything's made out of wood. There's poor construction code. It's not a great time, is what we're saying here. So when you have like all this recipe that's happening, right? This creates this opportunity of where there's a lot of like unrest that happens, right? So, within cities, um, we're going to show it's like a nighttime city because we have these golden lights when they're coming in. What would end up happening is that you would have people if they were hungry or they're starving or if they have low wages, they can't get enough work, right? This creates this opportunity for unrest, right? And what ends up happening is that you would have like these groups of people who are walking by, very angry, and are either fighting with one another, right? Or they're creating this opportunity of like there's like creating fires, right? You have like these riots and mobs that are violent, right? And a lot of like early America, like colonial times, right? There is all this unrest that's happening, right? This is a problem though, right? Because if you think about it, that you are like some sort of oligarch or otherwise city, you're just like a human being, right? We know that this violence is not cool, right? You're burning down like factories, you're burning down the buildings. We have all these diseases going on. There's open fighting in the streets, right? We got people dying over here. We're destroying stuff, hard to grow. It's really it's not great, right? It's not. There's a lot of things that we want. So we can think of like all these factors, right, that's going on, right, is that this is a big driver for the creation of police, right? A lot of social unrest and something that needs to be controlled, right? So, because the belief then is that the public can't be controlled, and something needs to be done. Now, this is very much like a very northern perspective on this, right? A lot of like urban, bigger cities, right? Because if we tell something that may be different from like a South perspective, maybe the police are created. Uh, for slave catching, right? You have to go find someone who's going to who escaped from the plantation master's place. So the police are created to run down those people and cross, into the north to attract people and bring them down, right? Point being, right, is that we have to understand like the creation of police between like these north and south barriers, because in the north, right, there isn't like slavery, right? So like they don't create the police to like fetch slaves, right? They do it in response to something else. In the South, more agrarian, more reliant on slaves to do all the cheap labor for free so you can make money, right? You need the police to go catch people, right? So very different drives depending on the geography, right? But we have to keep this in mind, right? Is that there are multiple reasons as to why the police are created. So when you think about like early police, right? If we have this in place, you know, first couple things that maybe make the police more attractive as a position, right? Boom. Item number one. This is like among the first public agencies. And what makes these positions attractive, right, is that they come with like a salary and pension, right? You're not completely dependent on market forces, right? You can actually like have a reliable government check, right? And that's one of the big reasons why government work is appealing. So it's very reliable, right? They always pay it out, right? So this government pays out, the money on a reliable, consistent basis, right? So that looks awesome, right? We love that. Looking real good, right? So the thing is, right, because there aren't any standards related to this, right? This is, and because it's a government position, right? This becomes, like eligible, maybe not eligible, right, but susceptible to corruption, right? Because if you want one of these kinds of jobs, they're very in high demand at this era, this time, right? This is going to cost money to the local political hall, right? So, you have to like pay for your position, right? There's a lot of corruption going on. Also, because there is this payment that comes into place, right? It also means that the police become involved in political activities, which in the modern era they're not supposed to do. What do I mean by police become involved in political activities, right? Well, in this case, what I'm referring to, right, is like voter suppression. So, like, either like intimidating people to not show up to the voting polls or to vote for certain candidates or to, use force against people who, like, so if you're an Irish candidate and you don't want Polish people voting, like, maybe you can beat up some Polish people to make sure they don't vote so that your Irish person get elected, like that kind of thing, right? Can also be used to be voter encouragement. So you use the police to get people to vote, right? So they're very much a political tool that's used to sway elections, right? And you get that because I'm paying you for my job, which means I'm in your employ as a, like as a patron, right?